Thank you all for being here with us today. And let's pull up the slides. And I'm going to give you guys the 5-minute version of what is happening out there with the attacks on critical race theory. So here we have this beautiful map that lays out some of the legislative actions that are happening across the country. So as of last week, 37 states have introduced some sort of classroom censorship or anti-CRT legislation in K-12 schools. 16 states have passed a bill, and 30 states have legislation currently pending. Some of them have multiple legislations pending. Missouri has 19 bills currently pending. Illinois, I believe, has about 11. So this is kind of the landscape. We're also seeing an increase in the number of legislative attacks as well as the severity. So since the beginning of January, there's been an average of 3 classroom censorship bills introduced every day. There also are there's more of them that are including a mandatory penalty now, which a lot of the 2021 bills did not have. So a lot of them now have a private right of action. So individuals, parents, or community members can sue schools or individual teachers. A lot of the legislation mandates states to withhold funding for districts that are found in violation. And a lot of this legislation also includes fines on individual educators, up to $10,000, per violation, as well as termination and disciplinary action. We're also seeing this year a 4-fold increase in the number of school board member recall efforts happening. So these attacks on what they are calling critical race theory, which we know is not actual critical race theory, but this umbrella term that's being used. It's very live, it's very active, it's not dying down, it's in fact increasing in intensity. So let's look at what's actually under attack. So if you could go to the next slide, we'll show that, as we know, the term critical race theory is being used as an umbrella term to encompass really any conversations around race, gender, sexuality that make somebody uncomfortable, right? So this is a list of terms that are considered to be red flags for, this is from a toolkit from an anti-CRT advocacy group called the Center for Renewing America. So I highlighted just a couple of them, but you can look through this list here, cultural awareness, equity, protecting vulnerable communities, multiculturalism, land acknowledgement, that these are the things that are being labeled as problematic and as red flags. And so as what they're calling critical race theory is getting banned, all of these things are being endangered, not only in the states where there are legislative attacks, but even in the states where there is not pending legislation. Because people are scared. People are scared that if they teach any of these things, if they promote any of these things in their school districts, the attacks are coming for them. So where are these attacks concentrated? We can hit this next slide. Interestingly, this is from a wonderful report from UCLA IDEA called the Conflicts Campaign. I'll drop the link in the chat in a little bit. The attacks are focused not in the most conservative districts and not in the most liberal districts, but in fact, in the swing districts. So those that are shifting to more liberal or more conservative, or that are politically contested. They're also happening, if you could go to the next slide, in the school districts that are experiencing the most rapid demographic change. Specifically, the districts where the percentage of white student enrollment has fallen by more than 18% in the past 20 years. In those rapid change districts, they're more than 3 times as likely to face attacks on critical race theory. And more than 7 in 10 of all of the impacted districts, this is also from that Conflict Campaign report, experienced at least a 10% drop in white enrollment in the past 20 years. So you can see it's that, really where you have these really shifting, politically contested districts, demographically shifting districts, that's where we're seeing the bulk of these, of this conflict. And that makes sense because really what we're experiencing here is a white racial backlash against changing demographics, right? And this is showing up in so many ways. This is showing up in the Charlottesville protest, in the replacement theory protest, in the riots that we've seen in different locations, where we've seen the insurrection January 6th, in the voter suppression efforts, right? In the wake of George Floyd's murder, we saw these widespread multiracial protests, including in mostly white and conservative communities, and a real increased consciousness around racial inequities. And that accelerated the significant progress that had already been made by communities organizing for racial equity over decades, right? And winning anti-racist policies on a whole range of issues. And we know from history about white backlashes. We know from, if we look historically, right, after Reconstruction, after the Civil Rights Movement, after the Obama presidency, we know that white backlashes are brutal and that they can be long lasting, and that the policies that they usher in are incredibly devastating. And so we are taking this very seriously. And we know that we need to bring everything we can to this moment to stop this legislation, and also to push back and to continue to advance the pro-equity, anti-racist policies that have been moving forward in school districts for the past few decades. And the additional piece of political context to give is just that white backlashes often have a political and electoral angle. And in this case, it does as well, right? The 2022 midterm elections are just around the corner. And this is a play to mobilize a racially anxious base to flip Congress, to come out and vote and flip Congress. And then additionally, sort of a third dynamic, as Akia mentioned earlier, is that this is a play for further privatization of public schools, that it's generating this sense that public schools have failed us, that they're dangerous, that they've betrayed us, and that to get combined with the hardships of remote schooling that families are coming off of, really encouraging parents to pull their kids out of public schools. And a lot of the legislation does that. So there's like a Virginia bill that if a school is found in violation of the bill, the parents are automatically eligible for vouchers from that school. There's also a Missouri law that says that when any fine money that is collected from districts or teachers, 80% of it goes directly into a fund for private and charter schools. So a lot of this legislation directly connects the attacks on CRT with a push for privatization measures. So there is some good news, though. If you go to the next slide, when we organize, we can win. We are just currently being out organized. So these are just a couple of examples of headlines from across the country from just the last few months. We've got Wisconsin, Nevada, Texas, Alaska, Connecticut on here, and I could have done, many dozens more. That these are efforts not just to stop the anti-CRT legislation, but actually to advance anti-racist policies, because the public is actually on our side in many school districts. And where people are organizing, we see new multiracial coalitions coming together. We see new individuals and organizations forming alliances to fight against book bans, against classroom censorship, for anti-racist policies, for culturally responsive education, and they are often winning. And this is possible.
That was wonderful. I thought you did an amazing job of giving us kind of the national landscape and how quickly this stuff is moving, and how quickly this backlash has translated into laws at the state level. I saw an amazing statistic recently, and by amazing, I mean terrible. Something like a third of kids now attend districts where some kind of an education gag order is in the books. So what I'm going to do, first of all, I'm going to try to speak slowly for the translators. I get very excited when I'm talking about these topics. I'm a little obsessed, as some people would say. But as you can see from the picture on the screen, we're actually going to start with a little trip in the time machine. We're headed back, it's 1974, and we are headed to Kanawha County, West Virginia. I host an education podcast, and it happens that my co-host is an education historian. And one of the things that I've learned with him is that we experience some version of a culture war panic around our schools again and again and again. And it's actually quite useful to go back and see what people were upset about and how it worked out. So this case in West Virginia, there was a group of parents, and they were very concerned about some textbooks. They were worried that the textbooks were anti-Christian, anti-white. They were worried about feminist messages, multicultural messages, but they were also just concerned that the kids in their community were going bad. It was the kids these days discourse. Kids were having public displays of affection. They were smoking. They were disrespectful to adults. And this all came to a head, and it actually got very violent. The building where the school board met was bombed. There were bomb threats at schools. parents pulled their kids out of schools. There was a parent strike. And then, they lost. They lost, as has so often been the case with these culture war parents. But there was one group that was paying very close attention. It was an organization called the Heritage Foundation. Some of you may have heard of it. It had been founded the previous year in 1973. And even as the sort of parent revolt was fading in Kanawha County, Heritage rushed to the scene. And they rushed to the scene because they thought they had an opportunity to turn parents against the public schools. This was already their mission back in 1973. And so they did everything they could through their publications and their microphone at the time, which was, relatively old-fashioned, to warn parents about all the isms that were present in the school, including cannibalism. So it's a good reminder that we see some common themes again and again. And one of them is the theme of opportunism. And that's our next slide. So I know I'm supposed to be going deep on things like the funding and the organizations, but I actually did the opposite for this. I took all of the names of the groups that I'm familiar with that are involved in these movements. Some of them are state level groups, some are national, some are think tanks, some are C4 organizations that fund candidates. And I put them into, what I think of as kind of a word salad, because the point that I would make is that there really is no difference between these various organizations. That there is, the Bradley Foundation and Freedom Works, which we heard James talking about, have had their eye on the same prize for a really long time. Americans for Prosperity, the DeVos family, and then groups that we're just starting to hear about now, like No Left Turn in Education, Parents Defending Education, and some wealthy individuals whose names are just popping up, like Thomas Smith. So I mentioned that one of our themes for tonight is opportunism. When my co-author of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door and I were finishing our book, we were doing our final proofread, and the pandemic had just started. We just, all of a sudden schools around the country were closing down, and it was this unprecedented moment. And the Heritage Foundation, which, now is closing in on 50 years old, immediately saw an opportunity. They put out a very official looking document. They put out a very official looking document. It was almost meant to look presidential, a White House commission document. And it was laying out all the things that Heritage thought that states should do in response to the pandemic. They happened to have a number of policy ideas handy. They've been waiting on the shelf all this time. And one of them was school privatization. Instead of funding public schools through the state, instead, what they were going to do, I'll move up a little closer so that people can hear me better. Instead, what they were recommending was that we switch from funding schools to funding what they called education freedom accounts, that the money would go directly to the parents and parents could use it however they wanted. It's an idea that's been around for a long time. It was proposed during the first part of the Reagan administration. They had some other ideas too, like getting rid of licensing requirements for teachers. Lots of the ideas that the groups in this word salad have been enthusiastic about for a really, really long time. Next slide. Now, one of the dangers of spending too much time with education historians is that it's easy to get the sense that there's really nothing new under the sun, right? Like anytime something happens, they can point to a previous moment in our history where people were just as worked up over something that was happening in and around the schools. Maybe it was sex education, maybe it was secular humanism, maybe it was feminism, you name it. There was or the teaching of evolution. There have been these moments again and again. But we need to dwell here for just a minute and talk about what is different about our current moment. So I am sure that many of you are familiar with this gentleman. His name is Christopher Ruffo. And even if you haven't encountered him in person or on the internet, you are feeling his influence. He is really has been the primary driver of the backlash against critical race theory. He works, believe it or not, at a think tank called the Manhattan Institute. And what is quite interesting about Ruffo is that he's very explicit about his goals. So last week he gave a speech at Hillsdale College, which is a Christian college in Michigan. And his speech was called Laying Siege to the Institutions. And he laid out he has a particular analysis of history. And his argument is that, basically after the 60s, the leftists realized that they couldn't win through things like marches and mobilizations, and instead they were going to take over all of the institutions. So if you believe him, people on the left run everything in this country. They run the media, they run higher education, they run K-12, and now they run all the corporations as well. And so Ruffo's conclusion was that we need to lay siege to the institutions, that the way forward is to sow almost universal distrust in our public schools, to lay the groundwork for a universal school choice program. Now, coincidentally, this happens to be the same vision that a lot of those organizations that I included in my word salad have also been pushing all this time. The difference is that Ruffo is really, he commands an audience that even somebody like a Betsy DeVos hasn't had. And so, for example, when Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is very likely to run for the presidency in 2024, when he signed into law what's called the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which not only bans, certain discussions of race and racism in schools, but it also prevents private companies from doing things like anti-discrimination trainings. Ruffo was right there and very clear on the fact that this was his idea and that other states should follow. Next slide, please. So you have seen some version of this story in the mainstream media again and again and again. This is actually not from the mainstream media. It's a Heritage Foundation report. We have been hearing about the Great Parent Revolt constantly, and the specific source of parent outrage keeps changing. So first it was about school closings, and then it morphed into things like masks. After that, it morphed into critical race theory and things like equity initiatives. Now it's morphing again into things like transgender athlete policies and discussion of gender and sexuality in schools. And yes, don't forget vaccine mandates, helpfully pointed out from the audience. And I think what's really interesting is to kind of lay that timeline over the map that Megan was describing for us, and to see what do the school districts look like where the parent revolt has been at its most heated. And what you see is exactly what she's describing. They are in communities where the demographic basis of the district is changing. White students are in decline. There are more minority students. And so what you often see is that it is students who are driving the push for more equitable treatment in school districts. If you think about a place like South Lake, Texas, which really emerged as kind of an epicenter of the backlash. There's a fantastic podcast called South Lake that I really recommend. It just got nominated for a Peabody Award today. Congratulations to NBC for that. What happened there was that students basically demanded that district leaders do something about what they described as an kind of a casual tolerance for racism that made life really hard for minority and LGBTQ students in that district. And so they pushed and protested, and they got the school district to act. And then you see this incredible backlash start as a result. And we are seeing similar things really happening all over the country in places like, Waukesha, Wisconsin. Students sign a petition demanding that the school district help do a better job of preparing them for the real world. And you see exactly the kind of demographic dynamic that Megan is talking about, a district that's not only in the throes of a racial transformation, but also a political transformation, a district that's turning from red to purple. And that's why you see this real intensity of the political flare-up. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's interesting is that we know that as the specific topics that are driving the parent revolt keep morphing, they're coalescing around topics that the general public finds less and less acceptable, which I think sets up a very interesting dynamic. So, for example, it's one thing to talk to people about how they feel about the idea of parent rights in the abstract. I think all sorts of people think that parents should be able to have more say in what happens in their kids' schools. We want parent involvement. But when parent rights emerges as demanding that specific books be yanked from the school library, books about race themes or LGBTQ issues, the public is overwhelmingly opposed to those. And they're opposed to those across party lines, which is really interesting because we're told again and again that this is basically this is a political divide that can't be breached. And so every time I hear a story about parent revolts and how this is going to be the cause that enables Republicans to retake power at every level in the midterm elections, I think back to data like this. Well, wait a second, if they're running on stuff that's deeply unpopular, doesn't that create an opening for groups like HEAL and the folks who are on this call to rally the public around an agenda that's much more popular? Last slide, please. So while you have been hearing a lot about the parent revolt, I can only imagine how many stories you've read about Virginia or the San Francisco school board election. What is really interesting is that if you actually go to states where these pitched battles have been playing out around school boards, you will find something astonishing that has largely gone uncovered by the mainstream media. And that is that when candidates run on these hard right platforms against things like critical race theory, and now on all kinds of issues related to trans kids and gay kids, they are not winning. This is a headline from New Hampshire where progressives won overwhelmingly in local school board elections. This was last month, and it was really just almost astonishing to see. And I'm talking about candidates who ran as full-throated supporters of public education, candidates who ran on a platform that kids needed to be taught honest history. And it turned out that we actually got to see that those loud voices we've heard so much of really are in the minority. And I think it brings us to what is the most important lesson of all of this. The agenda that's being pushed here, we're feeling it at the state level. It seems like there are just endless, groups and wealthy individuals and candidates behind it, but the agenda is not popular. And the point of the culture war and all of the heat that it's intended to generate is to distract people from the fact that this larger agenda of school privatization is deeply unpopular, right? That, it all comes back to what Christopher Ruffo said in that speech, that, they see this as an opportunity to convince constituents, especially Republican constituents, to turn against their own public schools, which is something that they have never been able to do. Now, somebody pointed out just now in the chat that there were, of course, there were conservative candidates who won. They gave Kenosha, Wisconsin as an example. Of course, that's the case, right? Like, these really are battles, but you would never know from the headlines that so many of these campaigns have turned out to be losers. Now, I just want to make one more point before I hand it over to the next speaker. I think part of the problem here is that because the mainstream media doesn't cover these elections that run counter to the narrative we keep hearing, the angry parent is going to flee the Democratic Party and hand Republicans the midterms in 2022. I think it sends the wrong message to Democratic Party leaders and pundits. And so they're constantly thinking about, well, what can we do to appease these angry parents? I know, let's run on a platform of weakening teachers' unions. Let's talk about school choice. Let's talk about the achievement gap. Instead of really focusing on this more powerful message about honest history and the need to defend public education as a democratic institution. And I'll leave it there because I think it would be great if we could open this up to questions from around the country. I know that we are so eager to learn from all of you about what you're seeing in your communities, so that we can do a better job of assisting you, but also, sort of spreading the word about what works and what doesn't. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to Megan.
All right, thank you. And I'm actually going to hand it to Floor, who's going to just to facilitate us here with some questions.
Right. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Flor. I'm from the NYU Metro Center, pronouns she and her. And I'm going to ask our first question here that we had in the chat box for James. And let's see here. So one of the questions we had was, does anyone know if insurance from MNE or MST cover fines for Missouri teachers? Was that one of the questions we were going to ask, or was there a direct one for him? James. Okay, great.
Honestly, I don't know the answer about that. It's a good question, and we can definitely do some research to try to find that out. There was another question also about unions. There's a couple of questions right in a row about unions, and one was just, are teacher unions, educator unions working with us on this project? And that answer is, I know. The answer is yes. Both the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, and the National Education Association, the NEA, the two largest teacher unions in the country, and actually the NEA is the largest labor union in the country, are partnering with us on that. And so if you are a member of any of those unions or know people that are, we would love to work with you all on this project. I mean, this is a Heal Together is an initiative, a school district organizing initiative of students, parents, families, and educators. And educators are huge stakeholders in this, and they are, as we have heard, being attacked. And as Jennifer's talked a lot about in her work, it's not an accident that they're attacking public education. It checks off a few boxes for them. It undermines multiracial democracy. It also is an attack on trying to privatize to make money off of education, but it also is an attack on our largest remaining organized labor in this country. And so we're all stakeholders in public education, but certainly the teachers are, and we're very excited to work with their unions and hope to engage more local unions and state educator unions around the country.
I would just add one follow-up to that. So I think it's great that the national unions are really, are playing a big role in this and have been very outspoken in their opposition to these education gag orders and stepping up to defend individual teachers who are sort of unfairly threatened with losing their jobs. But part of our problem is that for too long the teachers unions have been the only real, like, organized large force that has been left to play the essential role of defending public education. And if that's all we have this time around too, this is going to be a lost cause. So while it's great to have them, we need to be building coalitions that are much broader than that.
Right, and I'm going to open it up here for a few questions that we just got in. So one of them from Janice, and I'll come back to Tiffany's. The first question is, how can mainstream media be forced to change the narrative from sensationalism to what is most important to the majority of people or persons?
Well, wouldn't it be nice if we had the answer to that question? So I think a big part of the problem is that so much of the national media just really has no idea what's actually happening in other parts of the country, that they are clustered in places like New York and Washington. They're clustered in places where unions are really strong. And so they live in blue bubbles. And so I often feel these days when I read, I start each day reading a lot of newspapers, and I'll read reporters from the New York Times trying to cover things like the sudden spread of bills around the country targeting gay and lesbian kids and trans kids. And I really feel they don't have a good sense of what's happening on the ground. And so part of our job is, has to be to narrate what's happening around the country. And I think that's why the work that HEAL is doing is so important, that there are groups in every one of your states that really have a good sense of what's happening on the ground with respect to public education. And we need to help share those stories. And it's going to be that groundswell that forces the national media to respond. But we can't just hope that they're going to wake up one day and do a better job. We have to make them do a better job.
Thanks, Jennifer. And we'll come back to Tiffany's question as well, is how can we share this information with the general public without alienating folks?
Megan, I think you should take that one.
I was hoping you were going to answer that one, Jennifer.
Well, I can start and then,
Why don't you start? I'll add
you
in.
jump in. So, one of the things that's been so interesting about interviewing people in states like New Hampshire and Wisconsin and Indiana, where these fights have really been playing out, is that, people have no choice but to talk to their friends and neighbors. That because, if they aren't able to, they already know who agrees with them. The challenge is to win over the people who live in their communities who haven't read A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, right? So I would advise people to keep a lookout for potential openings. For example, we tend to think of the business community as being completely allied with the Republican Party, but the business community is not enthusiastic about this culture war stuff at all, right? Like suddenly Disney is a target. If you look at places, at states where these anti-CRT bills and parents' rights bills failed, it's because the business community, either played a role behind the scenes or, just let it be known that they were not enthusiastic about this. So there's an opening to talk to friends and neighbors, to get it away from, like the issue of, teachers unions and the terrain that a Christopher Ruffo wants you to talk about. And instead, like start with the thing that, they're most likely to agree with you about. The book banning, right? The education gag orders. the other thing I think is really key here, that when you look at states where there's been a big backlash in the past to some kind of like ideologically driven effort to kneecap the schools, I'm thinking of a state like Kansas, where they slashed state taxes, and as a result, parents, and it didn't matter where the parents lived or who they voted for, they saw school budgets slashed, they saw classes getting bigger, they saw teachers being laid off, they saw their own kids' opportunities being constrained. And that's how we have to start to talk about what's happening now. Do your friends and neighbors know that the company that runs the advanced placement test has said that kids who are in classes in places where key topics are banned those classes won't be called AP classes anymore, right? Like, that's the sort of thing that I think has the potential to win over folks who are not experts, especially if they are, parents of kids who are always thinking about, like what, where's their kid going to go to college, et cetera.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I think a couple of people put this in the chat, which I really appreciate, that like, this may not be the place to start. Like, the politics of it may not be the place to start. That the place to start, as Jennifer, as you were saying too, is just like, what do you care about for your kid?
Mm-hmm.
What's important to you? What do you think about banning books? And I'm just saying, I'm also dropping in the chat, the toolkit, the Heal Together toolkit has some great messaging and communications tools in it. But I think just like those intimate conversations about, what we care about, what we want for our schools are like the way in. And from there, we build to conversations that are, allow more vulnerability, where people may stretch, but it's sort of building that trust and the ability to talk about this first, I think, is really essential. And that I think a couple of people put some other resources in the chat around that sort of relational organizing and deep canvassing model, which I think has proven to be very effective.
Somebody just popped up in the chat, Ann Wood. Hi, Ann, pointing out that, this came up in the Virginia gubernatorial election, and that the Democratic candidate was totally unprepared to respond. And, I think the other real challenge we're facing with all of this is that the Democrats are unprepared to respond, that they have, when you think about, for example, during the Obama administration, the amount of effort they spent going after public schools and public school teachers, right? Not for the same kind, they weren't calling them, like sexual predators and groomers, but they were still, like, public schools were the reason why, we weren't succeeding internationally, right? Like, they had a very specific definition of what schools needed to do. And they spent a lot of time talking about schools as having failed. And so I think in a lot of ways, they laid the groundwork for that. And so when the Democratic candidate is up there on the stage in Virginia, and he makes the quote unquote gaffe about parents not having the right to shape curriculum at their kids' schools. Well, a big part of the reason for that was that, he was all in on a vision where that's the job of the business community, because we had this very narrowly defined vision of what schools do as preparing kids for the workforce. And so, it's not just that we're up against this, what feels like a very concerted attack on the right. It's that Democrats seem to have lost, they need our help remembering why we have public schools, and that we have them for more reasons than just helping individual kids get ahead, that they are foundational to our democracy. And you really don't hear Democrats spending a lot of time talking about that.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we don't miss any questions, that we're just having a discussion about whether we should keep it more location based or not. But I do want to make space for Yvonne, who had a question earlier in the chat, talking about Salem, Oregon, Pittsburgh, Las Vegas, Milwaukee. Do we see, I'll go back, parents and students are trying to combat a youth violence narrative. Has there been any overlap between the architects of these two narratives? Do we see that as a part of the plan to sow distrust in public ed?
So I have not seen that be a major part of the anti-CRT, now sort of anti-LGBTQ campaigns. But it's also the case that their messaging is wildly contradictory. And so if you think back to the early days of all this, when it was very focused on school reopening, the argument was that schools had to reopen. And then as soon as they did reopen, the argument shifted to schools are indoctrinating kids. So I would not be at all surprised if you started to hear a narrative like this. And I think it shows you like just how important it is to elevate the voices of students. And because they're so missing in all of this. And yet they're like, if you actually pay attention to what they're demanding as far as what they're taught or what's needed in school in order to make them feel safe, they're better positioned to disrupt these narratives than just about anybody. But I think that the questioner is absolutely right, that we're hearing a lot about that you can see how that will morph into the larger debate about crime, et cetera. So thanks for raising that. That's a good point.
Great, and I'm just going to pull a question from Laura here in the chat, and I'm not sure if we've covered this, but so there are a number of growing number of voices, specifically those who grew up in conservative evangelical communities with inside knowledge of these ideologies or historic memory of these movements in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Full disclosure, I'm one of those people. How best can they be involved in this national conversation?
Well, it's great to meet you, and I would love to interview you. I think that that's such a good point. When I was talking about how this moment has created an opportunity for us to build alliances that we haven't thought about in the past, this is one of them. I notice more and more voices like this as well. Because when people talk about, like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we just let students attend private schools? I think a lot of us have this image of, like a swanky private school in Massachusetts where there's, old brick buildings and a lacrosse team. But most private schools in this country are religious, and the fastest growing category are these very religious schools that use a canned curriculum. And the curriculum, you'll see things in it like, well, slavery wasn't that bad. Like, oh, the New Deal was a raw deal. People may have seen there was a big story in the New York Times just this week about a network of classical charter schools that's connected with Hillsdale College. And so, the idea is that even as these groups are attacking the public schools, they're seeking to shape a curriculum that influences the next generation to be more conservative in their thinking, right? And so we very much need to hear the voices of kids who have already lived through that. And especially, like adults who can point, a lot of these curriculums that I'm talking about are the same ones that they had. It's, things like Becca and Bob Jones, Pensacola Christian College. They can probably remember, specific courses. So we need to hold those voices up. And if you want to connect with me offline, that would be great. I would love to help share your story and anyone else's.
Thanks, Jennifer. And such a great question. I'd also like to give space for James to discuss or give some points on that as well, if you'd be open, James.
Sure. No, I mean, yes, everything Jennifer said. I mean, I think partly, what they're what these evil geniuses on these think tanks do is they try to find issues that really can speak, can rile up a base of people in communities, and also could speak to people that may be in, not in their base, but could be affected by their questions. And so a lot of what we want to do is actually also talking to people that are not there, kind of, we call it oftentimes like beyond the choir. And this has definitely been a big issue in New Hampshire, and also where I live in Vermont, of just demonstrating that if we bring it back to the core values of our community around what public education means to our community. I mean, many of our, especially in rural areas and suburban areas, there's really no community outside of the heart that surrounds our public schools. And it's where our future is cultivated. It's where our civic life often happens. And so if we can get out there and talk to folks that are not necessarily education justice or racial justice advocates and activists, but are stakeholders in their community, then we can bring forth a much broader coalition in support of that. And that's what we found, the divisive concepts law that now is in New Hampshire actually was broadly unpopular. The Republicans happen to be in power, as they are in a lot of state strategies, because they've had a strategic plan around that. But it is still not popular by the vast majority of people. There was all kinds of untraditional allies that were coming forward around opposing that, from the business community, certainly all kinds of faith community folks, people that don't consider themselves liberal or progressive, but thought it was an overreach. And so we definitely think, getting out and talking to people that don't necessarily agree with us on everything, but they can agree with us on how important, honest, accurate, and fully funded public education is for our communities.
Thanks for that, James. I'd like to pull another question from the chat, which is from Karen. How can we support progressive school board members when they're under constant verbal attack by ultra conservatives and even receive threats of physical violence?
I want to share a story from Arizona, which really has been just a hotbed of all of this stuff. And this was a huge concern there, especially, like their meetings became really, really contentious, first around school reopening and then around masks. And so the folks who were for safe school reopening really felt like they weren't sure what to do. They felt exactly the way that Karen has just described, that they could tell that, like folks were feeling less and less comfortable even going to a school board meeting and speaking. And that's exactly the point of that like the parent who is screaming, the organized groups that are trying to intimidate and threaten violence. The goal is to keep folks from feeling like they can participate in the democratic process. And so what these folks in Arizona did was they set about very systematically trying to demonstrate that, in fact, the parents who were raising the ruckus really did represent an extreme minority. And so they organized just an enormous coalition of every group you could think of that had a position on safe school reopening: doctors, hospitals, children's advocacy groups. They spread their message on social media. They gathered petitions. And as a result, they got quite a lot of press coverage. But the most important thing is that they were actually able to make the case that, like, we're the majority here, right? Not this, not the loud guy from, who has links to the Proud Boys, who is, menacing outside of your school board meeting. And so I think about that all the time, because we know from the polling that these views are not majority views, that the parents who are demanding that particular books be pulled from libraries, that those are minority views. it's so important that we demonstrate that, because the lesson that kids learn when the adults say, you know what, the school board meeting is just too tense, I don't feel safe anymore, I'm not going to go. Right? Or, like that, what kind of message does it send to the students when they're the ones being intimidated? So I think it's so essential that we figure out ways to push back on that and create a kind of larger culture of safety and power in numbers. And I bet somebody else has an answer to that too, because I know, like, James, you're in a place where this has been a big issue.
Yeah, I'll just say we actually, there was both good news and bad news in the chat about what's happening around the country. I'm in a place where we've gone through full circle around this. A year ago, we had an basically an anti-equity, anti-CRT parent run for school board and win. She actually was the leader of a group that opposed the students' effort to raise the Black Lives Matter flag at the schools. And she upset a 7-year incumbent and really shockwaves through the community. But the exciting thing about it, getting to the point around, how we can organize with people that actually share our values, is that it woke up a bunch of parents. There was a number of incredible students and teachers that worked around it, and they ended up, building a coalition to actually move forward with an equity plan in the school. And at the time of the election, it was kind of a question in the community, like, was there support for this equity plan? But they went out, they got petitions signed. They had the local toy store had a petition on the counter. The local bookstore had a petition on the counter. In a 5-day span, they got 1,200 petitions signed that they brought to the school board meeting. School board meetings that used to get like 6 people had 200 people at them. And the proposal ended up passing 8-1. The parent who started the parent group kept organizing, and her and another public education champion just had a showdown in an election last night, and ended up winning overwhelmingly against anti-CRT candidates. And it was because they connected with all kinds of people that were not stakeholders in this before, and all of a sudden we're like, these issues are incredibly important, and built a broad coalition. So it's a good example of, if people are not engaged, bad things can happen in those elections and those results. But when we go out and talk to people and invite people to join us, then actually we can win.
Great, James. And while we have you there, I just want to pull a question from Kirby, which is, does Race Forward have any solid goals around this that we can bring our coalitions to focus on?
Great question, Kirby. So yes, the goals, and we were going to get to this kind of at the end, and for folks that we launched this Heal Together initiative on March 30th with our partners that we were talking about. And what we're trying to do is work, there's over almost 15,000 school districts. There's 99,000 public schools. These are issues that are active in most of them. And so right now we're trying to provide tools to any group of parents, students, educators that want to organize around these issues for honest, accurate, and fully funded education in their school district. We're also partnering with some really awesome local organizing groups. Groups that are organizing oftentimes around education justice or around other issues of economic, social, racial, climate justice, and want to organize around education justice to help unite communities. So we'll talk a little bit about that, where we're partnering with groups, but we are trying to essentially work with anyone who wants to work on this, unions, organizing groups, and also support volunteer-led efforts. And that's where this training series is a part of our toolkits and technical support that we'll be providing. But we think this work needs to happen everywhere. And it's going to start by people, being able to demonstrate success that we can help lift up, and so people don't have to recreate the wheel. So one of the things, if you're already involved in efforts like this, please reach out. We want to not only be able to provide tools, but also learn from success that has been working in different kinds of communities.
Thank you, James. There's just a question I want to come back to so that we didn't forget it. This is from Andrew, speaking about Denver, Colorado. And so they say, I'm in Denver, and while this is happening, organizing in parts of Colorado, it isn't happening in Denver at all, at least not in the way that anyone's taking seriously. So 2 questions here. How do we make sure we are organizing in those areas where this is happening most? And second question, how do we make sure that the folks in the choir know how serious this is and then activate them to do something? What is that something? And yeah, there you go.
I get this question all the time because I live in Massachusetts, and people will always say, well, I know, you talk a lot about Florida and Arizona and Texas, but we're immune here, right? And I always say, no, you're not immune at all. Partly it's because, there are various things happening at the federal level that we have to keep an eye on. Our very conservative Supreme Court is intent on breaking down the wall between church and state that keeps federal dollars, keeps taxpayer dollars from going to religious schools. The majority of states have laws on their books that prohibit that, and the court would very much like to strike those down. So, a lot of the stuff that's happening now is part of a sort of a larger vision of doing away with public education. And, I think that the other thing that's really important is that in places like Denver, they've been under attack from a whole different set of reform organizations. And they've done an incredible job of resisting, right? That they basically, like, Denver has been a hot spot for kind of a corporate vision of education where you restructure schools along business lines, and the whole idea is that you introduce a certain kind of school choice. Everybody goes to a charter school, and there's been tremendous resistance to that idea within the Black community in Denver, because it turns out that all the schools that end up being closed due to low enrollment are schools in the Black community. And so there's already a big debate going on in Denver around racial equity. It just happens that it's in response to a different kind of education reform push. So I think part of what we have to do is get better at figuring out how to think about those two things together, because just because all the energy right now is on the right, the kind of centrist democratic vision of remaking schools along business lines has never gone away. They're as gung-ho about standardized testing as ever. And so that's why part of our organizing has to be to lay out this more positive agenda of why we have public schools and why they're so essential as part of a democracy.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd also like to pose this question for James from Becky. Can we have ways to connect with others in our states?
Absolutely. And I know, there's, I can just see from people in the chat, there's a lot of people that are already doing this work in their states. And we are excited to be able to have this initiative that starts at school district organizing. So, in terms of like what anyone can do, we strongly believe that we need to organize in our school districts. So, and everyone lives in a school district. So we can all organize with families, with students, with educators. But as we heard, that the policies that are happening right now on a state level and have happened on a federal level, actually have a huge impact on our local communities. So we want to rally our communities to unite us, especially when we think we need to unite more than ever coming out of the pandemic and the situation everyone's communities are going through. But it has to also be coordinated on a statewide strategy. So we're starting to work with organizing groups and the unions and other organizations in states to start trying to have a state strategy. So again, we'll put it in the chat, but any organization that wants to work with us, we want to work with you. And if you're not already connected with some of the other groups that we're connected with, and we're still connecting with new national organizations. So if you're part of it, please connect. And then if you're not involved in an organization and just like with a group of parents and other volunteers, well, we have we'd love to work with you to start organizing as well.
Right, thanks, James. And before I stop taking questions from the audience, if you want to just privately message me in case for some reason I forgot your question, feel free to do so. And if not, then I would like to propose opening up the discussion, some questions for the audience. So I'll just give a moment for that. Great.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Go ahead, Megan. Would you like to start the open discussion?
No, go for it.
Okay, so open discussion, first question. Has anyone seen groups like Freedom Works popping up in your area?
And I'm going to actually post a couple of questions we had in the chat. So, to feel free to answer any of them. And we also have about 10 minutes before we close. So if you want to raise your hand and unmute and share as well, we welcome that, or continue to use the chat. But would love to hear some of your voices.
Can I go, or how do we?
Go for it, Becky.
Becky Mostella, I'm in Douglas County, Colorado. We have FAIR, which Megan Kelly is one of the board of advisors. We have organized in Douglas. In Colorado, we had 10 school districts flip school boards. So people in Denver on here, we're here. We're just outside of Denver. We have not seen Moms for Liberty yet in Douglas. I know where I used to live in Tennessee, it's a problem. So that's I haven't seen Freedom Works yet, but we do have the Independence Institute in Douglas. So I would love to connect with other people in our state. And then I'm also curious, has there been reach out to each of the state education associations? So for instance, is Colorado Education Association, are they aware of these trainings? I used to be in CEA, but I don't know if they're aware of what's going on. Thanks.
Becky, that's a great question. We are trying. I'm not sure if I can say positively that not all the state teacher unions we were able to connect with yet. We are working with the nationals and increasingly more and more states. But if anyone here is has relationships with your state local unions or even your local unions, then please help us connect with them. We'd love to. One thing that I'll just say also just about teacher, I think most people know this. Partly we're coming up on Teacher Appreciation Week, the first week of May. We think a huge piece of this effort has to be communities rallying behind teachers. For most of you, I don't have to tell you that teachers have been through literally hell for the last couple of years. And so this is just, this whole culture wars, a lot of it, which actually is attacking teachers. In New Hampshire, there was a bounty on $500 reward for any teacher who was caught by the Moms of Liberty group teaching critical race theory. Just really attacking the teachers. And so partly, just wanted to emphasize, we want to work with the unions and to a huge degree, they've been in a crisis and survival mode. So, we also want to rally our communities to really support our teachers as part of supporting public education.
Right, and maybe I'll cue our second question in case anyone would like to speak on it. What forms of culture wars are you seeing in your community specifically?
Again, feel free to come off mute and share. It's nice to hear voices, if you'd like.
I'm not sure if there's anyone, I know there's a few folks in Virginia, but I just remember the tip line that made national news. I think a lot of people had fun with that, but there's apparently a lawsuit now against Governor Youngkin about releasing the records for that. But yeah, that was a big one. Like, I think it was after the mask mandate was repealed, like you could call a tip line if teachers were doing something you didn't like.
The tip line is still in operation, which is hilarious, and they have rejected the FOIA request for the information on the tip line and on the communication between the governor and the Secretary of Education, Amy Guidera, who's a data queen. And what's comical about that is that she spoke yesterday to the American Enterprise Institute, saying that a cornerstone and a non-negotiable of their administration was transparency. So yeah, there's not much here in Virginia. I live in Fairfax and have a lot of friends around the state, including in Loudoun. And we are organizing at the speed of light and doing everything. We have multiple organizations that are working together, Fund Our Schools, the VEA and Virginia Educators United. We have new small groups that have been popping up for public education, has formed in Fairfax and is now reaching out and also Stand and Deliver in Arlington. We've had since 2018 a lot of small organizers on a local and regional level, which are all networked behind the scenes. So we're all talking with each other and strategizing together. There will be a statewide symposium in Charlottesville, either the 17th or 25th, the 18th or the 25th of June. We're negotiating the dates, but all of those groups are going to be coming together to plan for the coming year. And for the 3 years, we're going to be under the gun from all of these really, really remarkably Trumpian playbook things. So yeah, it's fun and games. They're taking down data off of the website, the Department of Education website, even as they're saying they're going to be data driven.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for sharing that. I think we have time for one or two more comments. Everybody else has, a question for Jennifer, or anybody else that hasn't been asked yet, or something that you'd like to share with the group. Feel free to come off. It's great to hear from you guys.
I think one of the questions that I asked, and I'm a neighbor down the street, I'm in Loudoun, Virginia. I feel like we just lost an opportunity when all the anti-CRT rhetoric was starting, where it was this very defensive response to say, well, we're not doing CRT. So rather than claiming it and saying, we do want to talk about race, we do want to talk about racism, and I feel like we're just behind the 8 ball and being very defensive and saying, and then by saying we're not doing CRT, it's almost saying CRT is bad. You know what? Let's actually teach CRT in the school, and there's nothing wrong with even grade school students understanding how laws are built and perpetuate inequality. So I don't know, I feel like some of this is just how can we reframe the narrative? And I do this as somebody who's gonna very likely get my name on a ballot for the fall for school board. So asking for a friend who wants to reframe narrative.
Thanks, Erica. And yes, I mean, absolutely. And I'll say in the Heal Together toolkit, the communications guidance is very much along those lines. And I actually was trying to find, I couldn't find it, but if I do, I'll drop it later. A great article that I read from a community group in North Carolina that was saying, yeah, like if you find out the CRT is being taught in your school, you better sign your child up at that school. Like, you know, go for it. Sign me up. Where can I get some CRT for my child? And just that flip of like, yeah, like really, yeah, that denying that CRT is being taught in schools, you know, is not only misses an opportunity to give a message about what we actually want, but it actually reinforces in people's minds the idea is that CRT is being taught in schools, right? I heard a communications person say it's kind of like Richard Nixon saying, "I'm not a crook." Like what people come away is like, he's definitely a crook, right? And so that repeating that message actually has that unintended effect.
Thanks, Megan. And I know that we're at time here, but maybe I can make space for one more question from Latrez. If there's a strategy to connect educational truths with if laws have already been passed.
Latrish, can you say a little more about what you mean about that?
Sure. And I'm really sorry, I was typing and I did not intend to hit enter. But my question is really around if these very restrictive laws have already passed in your state, is there any opportunities around or strategies that folks on the ground can deploy to protect teachers, protect government employees who are implementing programs that center equity or diversity or inclusion, because those are also concepts that are included in a lot of these bills. Is there any kind of strategy after these bills are passed?
Jennifer, I'm curious if you have anything to add there. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it too, but we haven't heard from you in a little while.
Well, the only thing I would say, I would go back to what I was talking about earlier we have to start thinking about where is the push going to come from to start getting some of this stuff repealed. And, that it's going to be driven by the, parents who come to understand that their own kids' opportunities are being constrained by these laws, and then they turn on their legislators, right? And so like that's I think really recommend going back and looking at what happened in a state like Kansas. How did they organize? How did they end up throwing out one legislator after another? And it was really by documenting like what was happening to the schools. But I think you're so right about the need to to start to think about how are we going to protect people who end up being fodder for the grievance industrial complex, because that's the chilling effect of these laws. There don't have to be that many lawsuits. It's the idea that a teacher is going to be terrified of ending up on Tucker Carlson and called a groomer, right? That like, just to hell with it. I'm just not going to talk about anything. And so I think it's great that the unions have said, that they're going to be, they're going to play a role in defending people. I think some of the free speech groups like PEN have really just done a terrific job of documenting this stuff. But the next piece has to be like, how do we protect people whose livelihoods and reputations are at risk because they end up on the wrong side of somebody who's basically being incentivized to call the tip line, to file the lawsuit. And I think that's what makes this such a dangerous moment.
Thanks, Jennifer. And So we're going to hand it over to Asma now, but there was a question about homework before the next session, and I think Asma is actually going to introduce us with our homework piece. Asma, sorry, we're a little bit over time for you, but here you go.
Asma, are you on mute?
You're on mute, Asma.
Okay, so thank you. I want to thank everyone for your awesome questions, awesome answers, the wisdom, Jennifer, that you brought to this, Megan, James. Thanks for sharing what's been happening in your states, all of your wisdoms together. We heard a lot today, so really important information, and maybe this is heavy and a lot. We still have some more information to share, so if you can just bear with us we're going to go over just a few minutes. So before I do that, I'd really like for us to just stop for a second and breathe. This again was a lot of information, and maybe this was intense. So just inviting us to just take a deep breath in and breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. Thank you. I hope that was a little bit of some grounding. Again, I know this is intense. We wanted to share with you this map, and you see here is locations where we've actually begun working with groups. So we're hearing from folks all around the country that are doing this work. The dark green is states where we are currently working with organized groups that are already doing things on the ground. Our partners, NYU Metro Center, Alliance for Quality Education, and SHOT Foundation, and Race Forward, basically, we're meeting with these groups. So these groups include Wisconsin, the Kenosha Education Justice Coalition in Wisconsin. In Michigan, we're working with Michigan Education Justice Coalition. In New York, Black in the Burbs. In Vermont and New Hampshire, we're working with Rights and Democracy Institute. In Kentucky, we're working with Kentucky Student Voice. In North Carolina, Education Justice Alliance. In Louisiana, Step Up Louisiana. Mississippi, Southern Echo. In Georgia, we're working with Migrant Equity Southeast and Georgia Youth Justice Coalition, who are launching a statewide Heal Together tour, which is really exciting. And then you'll see a bunch of other states that are light green. These are our priority states where we're starting to talk with groups, and we're excited to work with these groups. The yellow states are where we've begun discussions. And then of course, in other states, we do have supporters. And of course, our groups that we're currently working with are also talking to groups within their own state. So these are not just the only groups that I mentioned that in some way, shape, or form are connected to us. And of course, we'd love to get all the places across the country to be dark green. That's our goal. So it's really important that this campaign includes everybody. You can talk to fellow students if you are a student, other parents, your neighbors, invite them to get support for their local schools, because schools are the hearts of our communities. So we're going to put a link in the chat right now for a form that we have. If you are interested in starting a HEAL campaign, whether it's a new campaign you want to start, or if you're already organizing and want to get support from us, you can fill this organizing form out. If somebody can drop it in the chat, that would be great from my team. And now we'll move on to the next slide. Thank you. So here is the Heal Together pledge. This is a way for any individual to support what we're doing. We know many of you already have signed it, but if you have not, we invite you to do so today. We would love to get even those who signed it to get other people to sign it. We are hoping to get, thousands or hundreds of thousands, hopefully millions, to sign this pledge. That they're going to not only embrace, but support honest, accurate, and fully funded education as the foundation to our country, multiracial democracy that we are still trying to birth in this nation. The next slide, please. We are super happy and thrilled to share this toolkit that you heard about earlier. Many of our hosts have talked a little bit about our toolkit, and this basically is kind of like how to organize in a box for all of you, or anyone who needs it, not just new organizers, but even organizers who have experience. There's something to gain definitely from this toolkit. It's for all of us to use, everyone working to organize in their communities. And we invite you tonight to look at it. It's amazing. There's messaging in it. And we want you to know we are updating the case studies from the amazing organizing that you all are doing. So we're going to update the toolkit with that throughout the country. So you will find a toolkit. We'll drop that right now in the chat. And remember what we said earlier, we'll also email it, so no pressure. Next slide, please. And finally, after you take the pledge and you get our toolkit and you fill out our wonderful form we talked about earlier, you're going to make sure to register for our future trainings. These are free to you, to the public, to your friends. The next one will be on April 27th on narrative and messaging. You heard we need to go beyond the choir. This is about a movement. This is not talking to the people that we know are in support. We know that the right has a base, and we know the left, but there's the majority of Americans actually fit right in the middle. And so if they are talking to the middle, what are we doing? So we got to really have those tough conversations. And we're going to be talking about that in our next training on April 27. We'll drop the link in the chat to register. If you can't make the next one, it's okay. There's other trainings as well that you can register for. You can register for that, or like all of them. That is totally okay. And we're offering these free to the public. So I hope you can join us. I think we've reached the end of our program, and I want to thank Jennifer Berkshire for joining us today and shedding light on what's happening behind these cultural wars. We want to thank our partners, Megan Hester, director of the NYU Metro Center, and Floor for sharing information and moderating the chats, and really talking about these attacks that are happening and how to prevent them. I want to thank James, who really was one of the people who really helped HEAL take off with Race Forward. So I want to thank him there. And wonderful interpreters, Selena and Louise, thank you. And we hope to see you all in our next training. So I'm going to say bye for now and hope you have a wonderful day. See you at our next training.